Hi there. Hi there. Heads of state, diplomats, scholars, and business leaders from hundreds of countries are in New York City for the annual United Nations General Assembly. U.S. President Donald Trump reiterated his America First philosophy with a list of accomplishments his administration has made to fight the threats mentioned in his speech last year, while his counterparts rebuked his isolationism. With today's divisions and disputes, how can we build peaceful, equitable, and sustainable societies as proposed in the theme for this year's assembly? And what is the United Nations' role in forming the new world order? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Xu Qingduo, who is a senior fellow at the Pango Institution, and Harvey Zodin, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we start, let's take a quick look at the highlights of U.S. President Donald Trump's statements at this year's UN General Assembly.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. Coming up in November, against my administration, they do not want me or us to win because I am the first president ever to challenge China on trade. And we are winning on trade. All U.S. nuclear-related sanctions will be in full force by early November. After that, the United States will pursue additional sanctions, tougher than ever before, to counter the entire range of Iran's malign conduct. Any individual or entity who fails to comply with these sanctions will face severe consequences.
Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. What do you think of the absence of both President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin from this year's UN General Assembly? Is it defiance, boycott, a show of dissatisfaction with the performance of President Trump?
I think it has a lot to do with President Trump's policy, right? We call it a unilateral approach. Basically, now he's hosting basically at least two sessions in the UN Security Council, and also to give speech at the UN General Assembly. And for those leaders, what else you can achieve or what you can talk to President Trump? And people probably will say, mostly it's like a waste of time. Why should we show up?
Do you think the presidential speech by Donald Trump sounds more like a monologue than a useful conversation on an occasion that aroused laughter from the audience?
Yeah, to me, as an American, I was nauseated to watch that speech, actually, because to see those heads of state laughing not with him, but at him is not surprising, but it was a real shock to me. And it shows how low the Americans have sunk. And it shows because, from what I saw, President Trump was surprised by the reaction, how disconnected he is from reality. And I think it just bodes so poorly for the future.
Let's look at what our State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi says at the UN General Assembly. Perhaps he could be regarded as the special envoy of our President, Mr. Xi Jinping.
Before I conclude, I need to point out that China has all along followed the principle of non-interference in other countries' domestic affairs. This is the tradition of Chinese foreign policy. Our observance of this principle has received acclaim from the international community. We do not and will not interfere in any country's domestic affairs. We refuse to accept any unwarranted accusations against China.
State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi dismissed the claim that China has stepped in to interfere with the midterm elections. What do you think of his protest?
Well, this is not the first time President Trump has pointed his hand at the Chinese side. For example, last time he said, why not we investigate the Chinese side? Possibly it's the Chinese who has stolen the emails of Hillary Clinton instead of the Russians. And for this time around, he actually does point to some so-called evidence. A Chinese newspaper basically, published a supplements in the local newspaper, the One, over there register. The thing is, this is quite a standard practice. It's not not only Chinese side, but also other countries that do something similar. Like basically, they are against the trade war. They're trying to persuade the people, let's not fight.
What do you think of the alleged stereotyped image of China? Whenever there's a campaign in your country, domestic politics would count and matter more than real issues between the two biggest economies. Harvey?
I think that we're in rough waters and headed for rougher waters. The United States has made a conscious decision to not only demonize Russia, but now to include China as well, for several reasons. I think one is to get the focus off of Russia, and the second reason, I believe, is to start giving China a hard time. The administration said as much, that they're going to start focusing more on China. So I think that this is just a continual ratcheting up of the trade war and the relationship between the two countries. And again, like I said, it doesn't bode well for our future, your future, the world's future.
But also at the same time, you can't help but wonder whether this is his gimmick, because the midterm elections are upcoming. Let's play up the China card. Let's create more hostility toward China. So somehow that will be helpful to his approval rate, let's say.
Yeah, I believe that that's true, because if you look at the tariffs that went into effect this week, the tariffs were for the first time on consumer goods by and large. And so I think Trump's strategy was to get the American public angry at not himself, who imposed these tariffs, but at China, because Americans will have to pay a greater price for goods, and I think it is part of a strategy.
Our defense minister has been recalled after the United States decides to punish, or after the U.S. government released a list of people from the PLA armed forces for the sanctions. Now, do you think the bilateral relationship, which was said to be the most consequential in the 21st century, would decline sharply, because the mil-to-mil ties is often described as the barometer, the first to be hurt and the last to be repaired?
I agree with you. I think we cannot rule out the possibility of a sharp decline in the bilateral relationship, which is probably the most important. Unfortunately, we are seeing some of the signs. They are not that encouraging. For example, the U.S. Not only engaging with China with a trade fight, but also imposing sanctions on the Chinese military, selling weapons to Taiwan, and also challenging China in South China Sea by flying a B-52 bomber over there. So you can see it's like a spillover of the trade fight into other areas. Instead of seeing cooperation in other areas, we are seeing actually worsening situation in basically different areas. So that's quite worrying, I would say.
And also a port call was rejected by the Chinese PLA in Hong Kong. What do you think of the deteriorating situation, Harvey?
It's not a happy situation, and I contrast it with what happened during the Obama administration. I mean, we were more friends than enemies at that time. We had our differences, a lot of differences, but the difference between that then and now is we had institutionalized dialogues on military issues, economic issues, cyber issues. We don't have those anymore. We're not talking to each other. When people talk, at least they can share ideas, concerns, and they can have a dialogue. But now there isn't a dialogue. There just seems to be saber rattling militarily, in trade, and in all other areas.
Well, let me add that, if you look at the senior officials in the White House, you see, the team of President Trump, like John Bolton, like you have Pompeo, Secretary of State, you have also Peter Navarro and Heather. All those people are very hardliner, to say the least. So it's kind of hard to see any improvement, at least in the short term, of China-U.S. relationship. They are not happy with basically, not only in trade but also in other areas.
They're extremists,
Is
the
this?
people in the White House. And team is the wrong word, I think, because they don't function like a well-oiled machine, which may be a good thing in this case, because it's chaos in the White House. And I think it's one of the problems that we have. But in this situation, maybe that's a good thing. They could do more damage if they were a team.
I agree. If you read the book Fear, right, in the White House, how chaotic it is.
We are not sure what is the playbook at this moment. Is that more about the domestic politics, the upcoming impeachment of President Trump, Stormy Daniel, that kind of affairs, or external threats allegedly that comes from Russia and China? So which one would come across as the most important one that's been prioritized on the agenda of the president and the so-called team in the White House?
I think the priority obviously is the election upcoming, 40 days to go.
But there's no doubt at the same time, Qinduo, China is the only issue that could unite both Democrats and Republicans across the aisle in the D.C. in their crusade against the most menacing strategic competitor, quote-unquote, namely China. And therefore, it's not just the issue of midterm elections. Mr. Orleans, chairman of the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations, said at a recently concluded economic forum in Beijing that midterm elections is not the facade. It's not the most important issue. In the wake of this midterm congressional elections, relationship will be very tough.
Let me explain. Yes, short-term, 40 days to go, midterm election. It's about the candidates from the Republican side and Democratic side. For President Trump, he would love to see the majority to continue to be enjoyed by the Republicans, so he can pass whatever legislation to implement his political agenda. But now, if the House of Representatives is going to be, say, occupied by the Democrats, then there's a likelihood, more or less, like he would be impeached. I don't think that's a small issue on his mind. Yes, long-term China is the issue. You view China as the challenger, as the main competitor. U.S. seems Republicans and Democrats are united in dealing with China. But I agree with you. I think it's dialogues, meetings they are necessary.
I think it's more than the issues that you mentioned. The Democrats, if they do get to control at least the House, have a list of dozens and dozens of investigations they want to conduct that have been rejected so far by this Republican Congress. So that's going to change the dynamics, whether there's an impeachment or not. But to me, the main issue is the state of mind of the president. And if it's a normal state of mind, I don't think it is. I don't know if he's mentally ill by definition of a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I know that his elevator doesn't stop at all the floors. And I know that he doesn't act normally. And this is worrisome, especially in that position.
Among all other accusations, at least President Trump deserves credit for honoring his campaign pledges. He's fixing the problem one by one according to his campaign agenda. Now, less than 1 year ago, he called Mr. Kim Jong-un of the DPRK a little rocket man, and he used words like fire and fury to describe the maximum pressure imposed on the DPRK to hopefully get the process of denuclearization moving. But with no apparent signs of any progress concerning the CVID denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula, why did he praise Mr. Kim Jong-un generously on this important occasion?
I would say ego.
Ego-driven predictability, or the other way around?
Ego plays an important part. He seems to, he talks a lot
more
about
than important.
Yeah, very important, more important than the real issue even. Like, oh, he likes me, I like him. He talks a lot about his dealing with other national leaders. Of course, he received letters from Mr. Kim Jong-un and praising him for what he has done. So he enjoyed receiving those words, obviously.
In Trump's mind, I think that he believes truly that he stopped a nuclear war just because the North Koreans have stopped testing nuclear weapons and missiles. But in point of fact, the North Koreans have apparently gone ahead and are developing more weapons during this period of time, and I think that that's very dangerous. But because of that word you used, ego, that Trump thinks everything is fine, and there's 3 words I think that Trump is thinking about: Nobel Peace Prize. And I think he still thinks that he has a chance.
Oh, he really wants to share the Nobel Peace Prize with the President Moon Jae-in of ROK. But why do you think President Trump fails to level the playing field in the case of Iran nuclear program ambitions, and at the same time as opposed to the DPRK case?
Well, in the sharp contrast, if you look at this Korean Peninsula issue, nuclear issue, you have South Korea, which is playing a very positive role in bringing not only the 2 countries closer, but also preparing for the peace talks or summit between the 2 leaders from North Korea and the United States. But if you look at the Middle East, if you look at neighbors of Iran, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Israel. They are the strong opponents of Iran. They would push the United States to the front line to confront Iran or to even launch attack against Iran. So it's a totally different situation. I think in the sense that President Trump, you can say, you know, I'm not sure he's fully familiar with the situation of Iran, but his people, his senior officials, they are very hawkish toward Iran.
But what do you think of the criticism by President Emmanuel Macron, who denounced the White House with words like the most serious confidence crisis arising from the cancellation of the Iran nuclear deal?
I think Macron and other European leaders who participated in the negotiation of the agreement are very angry. They want to keep it together. It's going to be very difficult to do so. The EU is trying its best by passing legislation that would supposedly or try to negate sanctions. But I believe that they're very angry about this, the Europeans, by and large. And I think the biggest fallout from this, aside from the fact that it might create another nuclear situation in that region, is that, again, Trump has proven that he can't be trusted insofar as any agreements that the United States signs. We don't know if they're going to be enforced the day after tomorrow or not, because Trump has just abrogated agreements right and left, and this is no way to run a country.
I think the French are in particular very much disappointed at the Trump administration. If you look at the Iranian deal, the U.S. withdrew from that deal. That's a sign of the collapse of multilateralism, basically. You know, the major powers agreed to deal with the Iranian issue in a collective way, and it's pretty effective and productive, but until the U.S. withdrew from that deal. If you look at the climate change deal, Paris Accord, that was signed in Paris, I think French people took pride in that, but the U.S. is the only country withdrawing from that Paris Accord. Yeah.
Next, let's take a look at what Iranian President Rouhani says about the United States. He calls the United States economic terrorism. Let's take a look.
I think we need to build together a long-term strategy, and it can't just boil down to sanctions and containment.
For many years, the scale and nature of Iran's nuclear program raised serious international concerns. The JCPOA was an important step forward in addressing these.
China encourages Iran to continue to fulfill the commitments it has made.
The unilateral withdrawal of the United States from this creates a serious threat for the non-proliferation regime.
This is, in fact, collective reactions from the P5 of the UN General Assembly, Security Council. Economic terrorism, I mean, this is a way strong wording against the United States after President Trump decides to pull out of the nuclear deal unilaterally. At the same time, I'm aware that a trilateral meeting has been held between Europeans, the United States, and Japan, talking about perhaps rebuilding a multilateral trade regime to replace the WTO. many of the Chinese netizens say this is a conspiracy theory that takes aim at China, since the entry into WTO by China back in the year 2001 was said to be a mistake by the United States. I mean, do you think we're going to face a entirely different set of trade rules to replace the WTO, which badly needs reform?
Well, it's unlikely. I would see possibly there would be reforms, and those reforms are necessary. They are overdue, and but the U.S. approach of talking to country one after the other, the bilateral approach, or you can call it unilateral approach, disregarding the existence of WTO, whatever mechanism over there. So this is quite damaging, because you can see the European countries, Canadians, the Chinese side, the Japanese side, they're trying to reach agreement, like what kind of reforms we need, and we are going to push forward. I think that's the right approach toward the near future.
But Trump has gone on record saying that he's against the WTO. He'd like to gut the WTO. He'd like to gut its primary provisions, like most favored nation, that have existed since the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. And so I think the Americans are going to try to do all they can to ruin the WTO. The only saving grace might be is the WTO is governed by consensus, so that means to make changes you need all its 150 or so members to make the decision. I think that's going to be difficult or impossible, even with the country the size of the United States leaning on the smaller countries.
That's right, because of the requirement for being consensus over there. So it's very difficult to implement all the necessary reforms. And besides, it takes time to implement those reforms, but at least we can take some steps. We can continue to move in the right direction, some of the urgent reforms. But unfortunately, the U.S., especially President Trump, he is interested in unilateral approach. He's interested in talking to Mexico, talking to Canada, one after the other, because of the U.S., the strength, economic strength. So the U.S. will take a huge advantage in speaking to a single individual country, even with the size of China, they still have this advantage. So that's why they have no interest, whatever interest in WTO, even maintaining such a multilateral framework over there.
I wonder if you guys agree with me that President Trump actually came up with a blacklist, putting China, Venezuela, the DPRK on the list. Well, he was praising the DPRK, but Venezuela is a country that the Trump administration bashed from time to time, and he's so critical of the so-called socialist regime under the leadership of President Maduro, and he vows to bring democracy back to Venezuela. What's going on there?
Well, I think it's a regime that the American country doesn't like, and I think they're also angry at China for really propping it up, because without China's help, Venezuela would have changed, the government would have changed, Maduro would not be there. But it's been a thorn in the side of America for a long, long time. I think Trump had a hit list, when he first got in office, and he continues to look at that list and amend it as time goes on.
Well, if you look at Venezuela, of course, they are in big trouble, but mostly because of the price fall of oil and the merchandise a few years ago. Now is catching up. So hopefully things could get better, and also the mismanagement by the government of the economy. So obviously that's their problem, both domestically and internationally. But then, Trump talked a lot about sovereignty. Where the respect of sovereignty of Venezuela? Leave them alone. Interventionism hasn't exactly produced the thing we want. Look at the Middle East, right? Look at Iraq. Look at Syria. Look at Libya today. There are people being sold as slaves because of the collapse of the previous regime. Government people don't like it, but where is the U.S. capable of producing the desirable, this perfect government in every country? No. If you can't do that, leave them alone, right?
It's kind of like this joke that was circulating during the Cold War. The Russians supposedly said, what's mine is mine, and what yours is negotiable. And I think that Trump could have saved a lot of words just by saying that yesterday in his speech.
But remember, during his UN speech, he also mentioned about the Monroe Doctrine.
Right, exactly.
It's interesting because the doctrine was declared being over in 2013 by a former Secretary of State, John Kerry. Said, oh, no, we are not engaging in the, we're not following that doctrine anymore. That's a respect of sovereignty of the Caribbean and Latin American countries. Now, today, you are talking about, again, what do you mean? People should question the president. Do you mean all those countries should follow the U.S. or U.S. is protecting those countries? Or is that the region sealed from foreign investment, from trade, from doing business with other countries like China? That's an issue somehow the media has missed.
Yeah. Let's take a closer look at the end game between the two countries, the United States and China, since a trade war is likely to spill into the mill-to-mill area, which is a roller coaster style, full of unpredictability in the foreseeable future. Are we going to have a repeat of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis in the South China Sea? Since the Pentagon has been patrolling the waters there, they say they are defending the freedom of navigation and overflight, and China opposes any patrols. What do you think of the escalation of tensions there? And across the Taiwan Strait, we are going to have more troubles at the same time, with midterm elections quite in favor, perhaps, in Tsai Ing-wen, whose economic performance is very bad, and her approval rating dropped to a historic low. But it seems the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea are the two most dangerous flashpoints between the two militaries.
But that's right. In particular, the cross-strait relationship or the Taiwan issue over there, because that issue, if President Trump understands clearly, that's to the very innermost heart of the Chinese. I don't think any sensible U.S. government will challenge China on that issue, because that's a sovereignty issue. That's an issue of territorial integrity. There's no way, there's no room for China to step back from that. If you look at the South China Sea, it's a bit less obviously dangerous issue over there. And people in the West often talk about freedom of navigation. Look, there's never been any issue of disruption of freedom of navigation. You heard any cases from the media or from any country? No. I understand that it's important to maintain freedom of navigation. Yes, it is maintained because China is a big country. China has its own aircraft carrier. China will also sail to other parts of the world. So freedom of navigation is fine, is good.
I think the South China Sea is much more dangerous in terms of some kind of escalation because of something accidental. If something accidental happened, it's unlikely with Taiwan, but I think the South China Seas, with all these kind of confrontations or near misses, one day there's going to be not a miss, and then things will be a miss.
On the agenda concerning hostility between the two countries, I'm afraid, could also be issues like Xinjiang, the alleged cyber theft, IPR transparency, so on and so forth. Well, it seems prospects of improving this relationship, the most consequential one in the 21st century, would be very difficult. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.